Hello, sociology students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 4, Section 1, The Importance of Socialization. So follow along and write down the things that you're going to need here as we go along. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about what socialization is. And really, that is the cultural process of learning to participate in group life. Socialization, for the most part, begins right at birth and continues throughout our life. So when we're born, we're for the most part learning basically about our environment and the primary environment that we're going to be really focused on in those first few years is our home, our family. As we get older, then we have to deal with school and maybe college and eventually maybe married life. And as we get older, when we look into our senior years, we may also be looking at socialization through careers and the changes that might happen there, and maybe even our golden years when you talk about maybe moving into a retirement home or a nursing home. So, socialization is vital for emotional and social growth. Successful socialization enables people to fit in well with all kinds of groups. It's a must if people are going to adjust to new situations. Without prolonged, intensive social contact, children who do not learn such basics as walking, talking, and loving, for the most part, fall behind their peers. Socialization also allows us to develop a new set of attitudes, beliefs, values, and behaviors associated with being an individual. When we talk about socialization, I mean, you could talk about in terms of how we learn our gender roles. When we start off as a child, that might begin with our parents picking a certain color to dress us in. So if you're a little girl, it might be putting your daughter in maybe clothing that's pink. And for a boy, maybe putting him in clothing that's maybe blue, and buying toys and maybe directing him into certain sports that fit their gender role. Along with that, we got to talk a little bit about children who might not necessarily be receiving proper socialization. And what might end up happening is we may have children that are what we would call feral. And a lot of that begins as a result of extreme isolation. Um, Children who may have been born and maybe sent to an orphanage might be delayed when we talk about the ability to talk and to walk, might show no signs of intelligence. Sometimes physically, they may be developmentally delayed or malformed as a result of some of this. Um, your textbooks, they talk a little bit about Anna and Isabella. And they were basically two textbook examples of children who were what I would call feral. Very similar to if you've ever been around animals like cats or dogs that have kind of been raised in the wild and haven't had a lot of human contact. For the most part, these children had no ability to communicate or to eat solid food or to stand alone or to straighten their arms. And their social behavior, for the most part, was very primitive. Sometimes with uh, human contact, especially if it happens at a very young age, a child may learn to trust and to develop, proper bonding with those people around them. But full development as a human being was prevented by isolation, abuse, and lack of human warmth, interaction, and contact. There are certainly a lot of research findings that have been kind of adding to the importance of human touch and things like that. You could talk about Harry Harlow and some of his research that he did on rhesus monkeys. But for the most part, we find that, you know, children need to know that they're loved, and human contact is part of that, even to the point now when we talk about children who are being born within a hospital. A lot of times the nurses and doctors are really watching to see how well the parents bond with that child before they leave the hospital with that child. So when we talk about perspectives on this, we've got to kind of look at The functionalist perspective, the conflict and the social interaction, symbolic interaction theory. Functionalists, for the most part, they explain socialization by stressing the ways in which groups work together to create a stable society. And societal groups could be anything from like your families, maybe your teams, maybe your school, could be the people that you work with. For the most part, socialize children by teaching them the basic norms, beliefs, and values. And when a person isn't following those things, there are, again, kind of like sanctions. Some of them informal, such as, maybe a certain look that you might get if you're not kind of following along. It could be a very formal sanction where you might get in trouble for breaking a rule at school and might be given maybe an in school detention or such. All of that is part of, again, understanding the function of socialization within our world. The conflict perspective, they kind of explain socialization as a way of perpetuating stratification in the status quo. Stratification is talking primarily about like the different classes and maybe the pecking order, if you want to call it that, where people have certain power over others. Status quo is basically keeping things the same. And by keeping things the same, maybe a certain group benefits from that opposed to having some kind of social change. But for the most part, socialization tries to maintain social, political, and economic advantages of the higher social classes. And if you remember back to Karl Marx, this is the thing that he was really kind of concerned about, and the fact that he was always kind of believing that maybe at some point in time there would be a classless society, that everybody would be treated with a certain amount of equity. Symbolic interactionist, their perspective developed years ago by Charles Horton Cooley and also George Herbert Mead. What they were basically pushing is that socialization challenges the belief that human nature is biologically determined and stated that human nature is a product of society, meaning that the society for which you live in for the most part, will direct what are the norms and such. So, what might be the norm maybe in rural America might not necessarily be the norm in urban America or the norm in maybe some other part of the world. So that's kind of the three big theories on the concept of socialization. Uh, your self concept, maybe the way that we see ourselves as our image of ourselves as being separate from other people. Cooley, for the most part, kind of developed this idea from watching his own kids playing, and he realized that they interpret how others react to them in many ways. So the looks that we give our children as parents, or the looks that maybe your teacher gives the students, all of that is part of how we learn and we developed how we feel about ourselves. Okay, from these insights, he theorized that children learn to judge themselves in terms of how they imagine others will react to them. And as a result of this, he kind of takes us into his own theory. And it basically becomes this idea of what we call the looking glass self or the mirror. The looking glass process is the result of how we use others as a mirror to reflect back what we imagine they think of us. So when I say something that might be kind of weird, I might watch the reaction of my best friend. And if they're looking at me like, oh, that was really stupid, I might get the idea that maybe that wasn't the appropriate thing to say. So, as a result of this unconscious process, is either a positive or negative self evaluation because the looking glass comes from our imagination. It may be distorted because you never know, maybe because of how somebody is feeling that particular day, they might not react in the way that maybe others would or how they would have on a different day. Um, and hence, the consequences to us are just as real as if they did really believe that, maybe they don't really care for what we had to say, they didn't like our joke or whatever. But needless to say, when we talk about our self concept, the self-image, we look at looks and styles. When we're at school, work, or college, we're kind of watching others to kind of see how we fit in. When we talk about how we, view things like beauty or health or fitness, a lot of times we're throwing that in by what we see, our friendships, our relationships. We're using that all the time to kind of judge that, what we consider to be the appropriate thing to do with our money, our possessions, what we should have, what we shouldn't have, to kind of fit in, and just really how our values and beliefs are going to be, set out. What might have been valued years ago may not necessarily be valued today. So all of this is kind of a part of that looking glass process. All right. Thank you very much.